The first rays of sunlight pierced through the tall windows of the presidential palace in Ouagadougou, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood alone in his office, his military boots echoing softly as he paced between the mahogany desk and the window overlooking the awakening city. The weight of the decision he was about to make pressed heavily on his shoulders, heavier than any uniform he had ever worn. Outside, the muezzin's call to prayer mixed with the distant sounds of vendors preparing for the morning market. The air was thick with the dry harmattan wind, carrying the scent of dust and the promise of change. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the red folder marked "Classified" that would alter the course of his nation's history. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the old colonial clock on the wall. "Mr. President, are you certain about this path?" asked General Ouedraogo, his trusted advisor, as he entered the office carrying 2 cups of steaming coffee. The older man's weathered face showed the concern of someone who had witnessed too many coups and counter-coups in their beloved Burkina Faso. Traoré turned from the window, his young face bearing an expression of determination that seemed to age him beyond his years. "General, our ancestors fought for this land with their blood, and we've been watching foreign soldiers patrol our streets, as if we're still a colony," he replied, his voice steady but filled with emotion. The 2 men sat across from each other, the morning light illuminating the fatigue in their eyes from a sleepless night of deliberation. Coffee steam rose between them like incense in a sacred ritual. "The people elected us to serve their interests, not to bow to foreign powers who see us only as a strategic chess piece." The decision had been building for months, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon during the rainy season. Intelligence reports scattered across his desk told the same story. Foreign military bases expanding, local communities displaced, and resources extracted while poverty persisted in the villages. Traoré's fingers traced the edge of a photograph showing children playing near a foreign military convoy, their innocent faces contrasting sharply with the armored vehicles. "Every morning I wake up and see those helicopters flying over our capital, and I ask myself, what kind of sovereignty is this?" His voice carried the pain of a leader who understood that true independence meant more than just a flag and an anthem. The weight of 22 million Burkinabe hopes rested on this moment. The morning call to prayer had ended, but Traoré felt he was about to begin his own spiritual journey. As the sun climbed higher, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold typical of the Sahel, Traoré walked to his desk and picked up his pen. The document before him would demand the immediate withdrawal of all foreign military forces from Burkina Faso territory within 30 days. His signature would be more than ink on paper. It would be a declaration that a new generation of African leaders was ready to reclaim their continent's destiny. The pen felt impossibly heavy in his hand as he thought of his mother's words when he first entered the military. "Son, serve your people, not your masters." General Ouedraogo stood at attention, his eyes filled with pride and apprehension in equal measure. Outside, the city was fully awake now, unaware that their young president was about to challenge the most powerful military alliance in the world. As Ibrahim Traoré signed his name with firm, deliberate strokes, the morning light seemed to shine brighter through the palace windows. The mahogany conference table in the cabinet room reflected the tense faces of Burkina Faso's leadership as they gathered for the most crucial meeting in the nation's recent history. Minister of Defense Colonel Zida arrived first, his uniform crisp despite the early hour, followed by Foreign Minister Sankara, whose diplomatic experience showed in her measured steps. The room filled with the rustle of papers and the soft clinks of water glasses being placed on the table. Outside, the palace gardens were alive with the songs of weaver birds, a stark contrast to the gravity within these walls. The air conditioning hummed steadily, but sweat beads formed on several foreheads as ministers took their seats. Cabinet Secretary Traoré distributed copies of the withdrawal demand, each page stamped with the presidential seal. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed to spotlight the document that would change everything. Colleagues, what we discuss here today will echo through generations, President Traoré began, his voice cutting through the nervous silence like a sharp blade. Minister of Economy Ouattara shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his calculator forgotten as he contemplated the financial implications. Mr. President, with respect, the economic consequences could be devastating. Foreign aid, investment partnerships, trade agreements, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Foreign Minister Sankara leaned forward, her diplomatic training evident in her careful words. The international community will not take this lightly, and we must be prepared for sanctions. The tension in the room was palpable, like the moment before lightning strikes during a storm. Defense Minister Zida remained silent, but his firm nod toward the president spoke volumes. The weight of history pressed down on every person in that room. "I've spent sleepless nights thinking about my daughter's future," said Education Minister Traoré, her voice trembling with emotion as she clutched a family photograph. "Will she grow up in a truly free Burkina Faso, or will she inherit our compromises and half-measures?" The question hung in the air like incense in a mosque, heavy and sacred. Health Minister Traoré, no relation to the president, added his support. "Our hospitals lack equipment, while foreign bases have state-of-the-art facilities their soldiers don't even use." The room fell silent, except for the distant sound of children playing in the palace courtyard, their laughter a reminder of what was at stake. Agriculture Minister Sawadogo spoke of farmers whose land had been requisitioned for foreign military exercises. Each minister's story added another layer to the collective pain of a nation tired of being treated as a junior partner in its own affairs. As the meeting progressed, the initial fear gave way to a quiet determination that filled the room like morning mist rising from the savannah. "If we don't act now, when will we?" asked Justice Minister Nignan, his legal mind cutting through the emotional fog. President Traoré looked around the table at faces that had transformed from uncertainty to resolve. "We are not just making a political decision. We are answering the call of our ancestors who died for this land's freedom." The vote was unanimous, each yes spoken with increasing conviction. Outside, the muezzin's midday call to prayer began, as if blessing their decision. As the ministers signed the historic document one by one, their signatures seemed to write a new chapter in African sovereignty. The meeting ended not with handshakes, but with embraces that felt like a sacred pact between guardians of the nation's future. The national television studio had never felt more charged with electricity as technicians made final adjustments to the cameras and lighting. President Traoré sat behind the presidential podium, the Burkina Faso flag draped majestically behind him, its red, white and green colors seeming more vibrant under the studio lights. His speech, handwritten on simple paper rather than the usual teleprompter, lay before him like a sacred text. The makeup artist applied a final touch of powder to his forehead, her hands shaking slightly as she understood the magnitude of the moment. Outside the studio, palace guards stood at attention, their usual routine transformed into something ceremonial and historic. The director's countdown echoed in the hushed studio. "Live in 30 seconds, Mr. President." Time seemed to slow as the red recording light prepared to illuminate, signaling that history was about to be broadcast to the world. "Citizens of Burkina Faso, brothers and sisters of Africa, and friends around the world," Traoré began, his voice steady, but carrying the emotional weight of 22 million hopes. His eyes looked directly into the camera, as if speaking personally to every viewer, from the markets of Bobo Dioulasso to the villages of the Sahel. "Today, we exercise our sovereign right as a free and independent nation to determine our own destiny and security arrangements. The words hung in the air like a prayer, each syllable carefully chosen for maximum impact. Behind the cameras, studio staff stood frozen, understanding they were witnessing a pivotal moment in African history. His hands remained steady on the podium despite the magnitude of what he was announcing. The silence between sentences felt like the pause before thunder follows lightning. Effective immediately, the government of Burkina Faso formally requests the withdrawal of all foreign military forces from our territory within 30 days, the president declared, his voice growing stronger with each word. The camera captured the slight tremor in his jaw as he delivered the line that would send shockwaves through NATO headquarters in Brussels. This decision reflects our unwavering commitment to true sovereignty and our belief that Burkina Faso's security is best guaranteed by Burkinabe forces. In living rooms across the nation, families gathered around television sets fell silent, understanding that their young leader had just challenged the world's most powerful military alliance. The studio lights seemed to grow brighter, as if illuminating not just a man, but a movement. His military bearing, earned through years of service, gave weight to words that might have seemed impossible from another leader. Even the camera operators found themselves holding their breath. As the broadcast concluded, Traoré remained seated for a moment, the weight of what he had just unleashed settling upon him like a heavy blanket. The red recording light dimmed, but the president knew that the real spotlight had just been turned on his nation. God bless Burkina Faso, and may we find the courage to walk the path of true independence, were his final words, spoken almost as a prayer. The studio erupted in spontaneous applause from the technical crew, their professional neutrality overcome by the historic nature of the moment. Outside, car horns began honking as news of the declaration spread through the streets like wildfire. Social media platforms exploded with reactions from around the continent and beyond, hashtags trending within minutes. As President Traoré rose from his chair, he carried himself not just as a military officer or politician, but as a man who had just altered the course of African history with 15 minutes of carefully chosen words. The NATO headquarters in Brussels buzzed with unprecedented urgency as emergency meetings were called at dawn, European time. Secretary-General Stoltenberg's office filled with senior officials, their faces grave as they watched replays of Traoré's declaration on multiple screens. The marble corridors, usually echoing with measured diplomatic footsteps, now resonated with the hurried pace of crisis management. Coffee cups multiplied on conference tables as staff worked through what should have been their weekend rest. Red phones rang incessantly as calls poured in from Washington, Paris, London and Berlin, each capital demanding immediate briefings. The alliance's carefully constructed African strategy, built over decades, seemed to crumble in real time. Outside, the Belgian morning rain tapped against bulletproof windows like an ominous drumbeat. "This is not just Burkina Faso," warned General Morrison, NATO's supreme allied commander, his American accent cutting through the multilingual chatter in the war room. The wall-mounted screens displayed detailed maps of West Africa, with red markers indicating military installations that were now under threat. French Defense Minister Leclerc paced nervously, his phone buzzing with calls from the Élysée Palace as President Macron demanded answers. "If Burkina falls in line with Mali and Niger, we're looking at a complete reshuffling of the Sahel region," added the British representative, her diplomatic composure barely masking deep concern. The room's atmosphere grew heavier as intelligence reports confirmed massive celebrations in the streets of Ouagadougou. German officials whispered about the potential domino effect across their former spheres of influence. Each official present understood that they were witnessing the unraveling of a post-colonial order that had endured for over 6 decades. Polish Ambassador Kowalski, representing the newer NATO members, spoke with the passion of someone whose country had experienced foreign occupation. "Perhaps we should listen to what these young African leaders are actually saying about sovereignty," His words created an uncomfortable silence that settled over the room like morning fog over the Brussels suburbs. The Swedish representative nodded slowly, while French officials exchanged sharp glances that could freeze water. "With respect, Ambassador, this threatens our entire counter-terrorism architecture in the region," replied the French military attaché, his voice tight with frustration. The ideological divide within the alliance became apparent as Eastern European members showed unexpected sympathy for Traoré's position. American officials remained largely silent, calculating the implications for their global military posture. The meeting that was supposed to produce a unified response instead revealed deep fissures within the Western alliance. As evening fell over Brussels, the emergency session continued with no clear consensus emerging from hours of heated debate. Secretary-General Stoltenberg found himself mediating between hawks calling for economic sanctions and moderates urging diplomatic engagement. The coffee had grown cold, replaced by stronger beverages, as the gravity of the situation fully sank in. "Gentlemen and ladies, we're not just losing military bases, we're witnessing the birth of a new generation of African leadership that refuses to play by our rules," observed the Norwegian Secretary-General. Outside NATO headquarters, protesters had gathered with signs supporting African sovereignty, their chants audible through the reinforced windows. The rain had stopped, but the storm over the alliance's African policy had only just begun. As midnight approached, officials realized they were facing not just a Burkina Faso challenge, but a fundamental questioning of Western military presence across the global south. The secure video conference connecting NATO capitals flickered to life at 0600 GMT, faces of world leaders materializing on screens like ghosts in the digital dawn. President Biden, despite the early Washington hour, appeared alert and focused, his coffee cup bearing the presidential seal. President Macron's image from the Élysée Palace dominated the center screen, his expression revealing the particular sting this represented for France's African interests. Prime Minister Sunak joined from Downing Street, while Chancellor Scholz connected from Berlin, each leader surrounded by their most trusted advisors. The encrypted connection carried the weight of conversations that would reshape international relations. Technical staff ensured absolute privacy as these power brokers prepared to craft their response. The digital meeting room held more tension than any physical space could contain. "This Traoré thinks he can simply dismiss decades of strategic partnership," Macron began, his French accent thickening with frustration as he gestured toward documents scattered across his ornate desk. Biden leaned forward, his decades of foreign policy experience evident in his measured response. "Emmanuel, we need to be careful not to validate every African leader who decides to play the sovereignty card." The German Chancellor adjusted his glasses thoughtfully, representing Europe's largest economy and its complex relationship with post-colonial responsibilities. "The optics matter enormously here. We cannot appear to be bullying a developing nation," Scholz cautioned, his engineering background evident in his systematic approach. Sunak nodded from London, mindful of Britain's own complicated African legacy. The conversation revealed deep divisions between aggressive intervention and diplomatic restraint. Each leader calculated domestic political costs alongside international strategic interests. "Our intelligence suggests this decision has overwhelming popular support in Burkina Faso," reported CIA Director Burns, his briefing papers rustling audibly through the secure connection. The revelation shifted the room's dynamic as leaders realized they faced not just one man's decision, but an entire nation's will. Macron's defense minister whispered urgently in his ear, sharing reports from French military commanders in the region. "If we push too hard, we risk creating a martyr and accelerating the domino effect across West Africa," warned the British Foreign Secretary. Biden's national security advisor highlighted similar concerns from American military leadership. The leaders found themselves trapped between appearing strong and avoiding actions that would validate African claims of neo-colonial behavior. Every option carried risks that could backfire spectacularly. As the secure conference stretched into its third hour, consensus remained elusive among the Atlantic Alliance's most powerful members. We propose a graduated response: diplomatic pressure, economic incentives, and targeted sanctions if necessary, suggested the American Secretary of State. Macron remained skeptical, his personal investment in African relations making compromise difficult. The credibility of our entire Sahel strategy depends on our response to this challenge, he insisted, his voice carrying decades of French-African policy. Scholz proposed EU mediation, while Sunak suggested working through the African Union to find face-saving solutions. The video conference revealed that NATO's strength in conventional warfare didn't translate to effectiveness against diplomatic declarations. As screens began disconnecting, each leader carried away different interpretations of what constituted an appropriate response. The alliance that had faced down the Soviet Union struggled to address a young African captain's simple demand for sovereignty. The dusty streets of Ouagadougou erupted in spontaneous celebration as news of the president's declaration spread like wildfire through the capital's neighborhoods. Mamadou, a motorcycle taxi driver, abandoned his bike in the middle of Avenue Kwame Nkrumah and joined the growing crowd dancing to the rhythm of djembe drums. Market women ululated with joy, their colorful pagnes swirling as they danced, while young men climbed onto the roofs of taxis and buses, waving Burkinabe flags. The air filled with the sweet scent of incense and the dust kicked up by hundreds of feet moving in celebration. Finally, we have a president who speaks for us, not for the white man's money, shouted Aminata, an elderly woman selling tomatoes at the Grand Marché. Children ran between the adults, their laughter mixing with chants of Traore, Traore, echoing off the concrete buildings. The celebration felt like Independence Day, but sweeter because it was chosen, not given. In the Sisson neighborhood, university students gathered around a battered radio, their eyes bright with hope as they listened to repeated broadcasts of the presidential address. "This is what Thomas Sankara would have done," declared Fatou, a political science student, her voice trembling with emotion as she invoked the name of Burkina Faso's revolutionary hero. Her classmates nodded vigorously, understanding that they were witnessing history being made by someone from their own generation. The small room filled with passionate debate about sovereignty, dignity, and the future of Africa. Outside, the call to prayer mixed with revolutionary songs from the 1980s, as older residents shared their memories of true independence. Books about African liberation movements passed from hand to hand like sacred texts. The students felt their studies coming alive in the streets beyond their campus walls. Not everyone celebrated with equal enthusiasm, and concerned whispers spread through the expatriate community and business districts of Ouaga 2000. Jean-Baptiste, who managed a logistics company serving foreign military contracts, worried about his family's future as he watched the celebrations from his office window. "This is madness. We depend on these partnerships for jobs, for security," he muttered to his colleague, adjusting his tie nervously. In the upscale neighborhoods, some residents gathered in living rooms, their conversations more subdued as they calculated the economic implications. French expatriates made urgent phone calls to family back home, unsure whether they should remain or evacuate. The city's elite, who had built their wealth on international connections, faced an uncertain future. Their anxiety contrasted sharply with the joy echoing from the majority of neighborhoods. As night fell over Ouagadougou, fires lit up the sky, not from violence, but from celebration feasts shared in courtyards across the city. Families who could barely afford meat slaughtered chickens and goats to mark this historic day. The aroma of grilled meat and atieke filled the warm evening air as communities came together to feast and dream. Griots sang new songs about the young captain who dared to challenge the world's most powerful armies. Children fell asleep to stories their grandparents told about the heroes of African independence movements. In the distance, traditional drums communicated the news to villages beyond the capital, spreading the word through ancient networks. The celebration continued until dawn, as if the people wanted to make sure the world understood that this decision belonged not just to one man, but to an entire nation ready to reclaim its destiny. The secure diplomatic pouches arriving at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Ouagadougou carried messages that could determine the fate of a nation. Foreign Minister Sankara's office had become a war room, with diplomats from major powers requesting urgent meetings within hours of Traoré's declaration. The French ambassador arrived first, his usual diplomatic smile replaced by a stern expression that spoke louder than any words. German, British and American envoys followed in quick succession, their black sedans creating an unusual convoy outside the ministry building. Each carried carefully crafted messages from their capitals, mixing diplomatic language with barely concealed threats. The ministry's marble floors echoed with the footsteps of history as these conversations would determine whether diplomacy could prevent a larger crisis. Secretary Traoré coordinated the meetings like a chess master, understanding that the order and timing of each encounter carried strategic significance. Minister Sankara, France has been Burkina Faso's partner for over 60 years, began Ambassador Dubois, his diplomatic training evident in his controlled tone, despite the gravity of the situation. The French envoy placed a leather folder on the mahogany table, its contents representing decades of economic partnerships and security cooperation. We urge your government to reconsider this hasty decision before irreparable damage is done to our relationship, he continued, his words carrying the weight of potential economic consequences. Minister Sankara listened with the patience of someone trained in international law, her fingers steepled as she calculated responses. The room's air conditioning hummed softly, but tension made the atmosphere feel suffocating. Behind the ambassador's diplomatic language lay threats of aid suspension, trade restrictions, and international isolation. The conversation danced between respect and intimidation that had defined Franco-African relations for generations. The American envoy arrived with a different approach, emphasizing security concerns and regional stability in his presentation to the foreign minister. Minister, we share your aspirations for sovereignty, but the terrorism threat in the Sahel requires continued international cooperation, Ambassador Johnson stated, spreading satellite images across the conference table. His briefing highlighted recent terrorist activities in neighboring countries, painting a picture of chaos without Western military presence. The implied message was clear: withdraw Western support and face the consequences of regional instability alone. Minister Sankara studied the images carefully, understanding that each photograph represented both legitimate security concerns and subtle coercion. The American diplomat's tone remained respectful, but his country's military and economic power gave his words additional weight. Behind diplomatic courtesy lay the machinery of sanctions, international pressure, and economic warfare that had brought other African nations to heel. As evening approached, Minister Sankara convened her senior diplomatic staff to analyze the day's messages and threats. They offer carrots and sticks, but both come with chains attached, observed Deputy Minister Traoré, summarizing the day's encounters with characteristic directness. The diplomatic cables from various capitals revealed a coordinated response designed to isolate Burkina Faso economically and politically. Russian and Chinese embassies had also requested meetings, offering alternative partnerships that came with their own complications and expectations. The ministry staff worked late into the night, crafting responses that would maintain dignity while keeping diplomatic doors open. Outside, the celebration in the streets continued, unaware of the diplomatic storm brewing in the halls of power. As Foreign Minister Sankara prepared her recommendations for President Traoré, she understood that the next few days would test every skill she had learned in her diplomatic career. The French military base at Camboinsin, just outside Ouagadougou, became a fortress of uncertainty as soldiers received conflicting orders from Paris and faced an unprecedented situation. Colonel Laurent, the base commander, paced in his air-conditioned office while reviewing legal documents that no military academy had prepared him for. Outside his window, Burkinabe military vehicles had positioned themselves at strategic points around the perimeter, their presence more symbolic than threatening but unmistakably clear. The base's 200 French soldiers continued their daily routines, but conversations in the mess hall carried undertones of confusion and concern. Radio communications with Paris crackled with tension as politicians and generals debated response strategies thousands of miles away. Local Burkinabe staff, who had worked on the base for years, moved through their duties with unusual quiet, caught between their jobs and their national loyalty. The 30-day countdown had begun, and each sunrise brought the deadline closer. Captain Traoré of the Burkinabe Armed Forces stood at the main gate, his orders clear, but his heart heavy as he faced French soldiers he had trained alongside in previous joint exercises. "Colonel Laurent, I have orders to ensure the orderly withdrawal of foreign forces within the established time frame," he announced formally, his English precise despite the emotional weight of the moment. The French colonel emerged from the base headquarters, his uniform impeccable, but his face showing the strain of a career soldier caught in a political storm. Both officers understood that their personal friendship meant nothing in the face of national sovereignty and international politics. The gate between them seemed to symbolize more than just base security. It represented the chasm between colonial past and independent future. Their handshake was firm but brief, professional courtesy masking deeper tensions. Around them, soldiers from both nations watched this historic confrontation unfold. Similar scenes played out at the American drone base in the north, where sophisticated surveillance equipment worth millions of dollars faced an uncertain future. Major Williams briefed his team on contingency plans, while intelligence analysts worked frantically to secure classified materials and destroy sensitive documents. The base's strategic importance in monitoring Sahel terrorism made its potential closure a nightmare scenario for Pentagon planners. Local workers who maintained the facility found themselves in an impossible position, torn between economic necessity and patriotic duty. Satellite dishes that had tracked terrorist movements across the region stood silent, their operators unsure whether they would function tomorrow. The irony was not lost on anyone that America's most advanced technology faced defeat not by enemy action, but by diplomatic declaration. Military precision met political reality as soldiers packed equipment they had never expected to move. As tensions escalated throughout the week, international media descended on Burkina Faso like vultures sensing a major story. The world watched as a young African nation faced down global superpowers through peaceful but firm insistence on sovereignty. Military analysts on television debated scenarios ranging from economic sanctions to potential intervention, while social media exploded with support for Traoré's stance. The bases became symbols of a larger struggle between old colonial relationships and new African assertiveness. Foreign soldiers found themselves unwilling participants in a historical moment that would define the future of international relations. Each day brought new diplomatic notes, military assessments, and growing pressure from all sides. The standoff had become more than just a military withdrawal. It represented a fundamental challenge to the post-colonial order that had governed African-Western relations for decades. The African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa buzzed with urgent activity as news of Traoré's declaration sent shockwaves across the continent's diplomatic corridors. Chairman Moussa Faki called an emergency session, his Chadian diplomatic experience recognizing the historical significance of this moment for African sovereignty. Delegates from 55 member states gathered in the main assembly hall, their conversations creating a symphony of languages that reflected the continent's diversity and shared struggles. The Ethiopian morning sun streamed through the building's windows, illuminating faces that carried both hope and concern for their Burkinabe brothers. Secretaries rushed between offices, carrying urgent communications from capitals across Africa, each message weighing the implications for their own relationships with former colonial powers. The marble floors echoed with footsteps of history as African leaders prepared to take a collective stand. Outside, Ethiopian protesters gathered with signs supporting Burkina Faso, their chants audible through the reinforced windows of the diplomatic complex. President Félix Tshisekedi of the Democratic Republic of Congo was among the first to publicly endorse Traoré's decision, his own experience with foreign interference lending weight to his support. What Captain Traoré has done is what every African leader should have the courage to do, he declared at a press conference in Kinshasa, his words broadcast across the continent. South African President Ramaphosa followed with a measured statement supporting the principle of sovereignty while calling for peaceful dialogue. Nigeria's leadership remained cautiously supportive, understanding the delicate balance between sovereignty and international partnerships that affected Africa's largest economy. From Accra, Ghana's president emphasized the importance of African solutions to African problems. The statements created a domino effect of support that surprised Western capitals expecting African division. Each endorsement strengthened Traoré's position and legitimized his challenge to foreign military presence. In Lagos, the bustling commercial capital of Nigeria, street celebrations erupted as news spread through social media and radio broadcasts. Young Nigerians gathered in universities and markets, holding impromptu rallies supporting their Burkinabe brothers, their voices rising above the typical Lagos traffic noise. "If small Burkina can stand up to France and America, what excuse do we have?" shouted a university student in Ibadan, her words capturing the sentiment spreading across Anglophone Africa. Kenyan activists in Nairobi organized solidarity marches, while South African students sang liberation songs outside the French embassy in Pretoria. The hashtag #JaAfrica for Africans trended across the continent, uniting diverse populations in support of genuine independence. Social media became a powerful tool for continental solidarity, connecting protesters from Cairo to Cape Town. The response revealed a deep well of Pan-African sentiment that had been waiting for the right moment to surface. From Mali and Niger, where similar struggles against foreign military presence had been ongoing, expressions of solidarity poured in through diplomatic and unofficial channels. The leaders of these Sahel nations understood that Traoré's success would validate their own efforts to reclaim sovereignty from former colonial powers. Senegalese intellectuals wrote passionate op-eds in Le Soleil newspaper, arguing that the time had come for a new generation of African leadership uncompromised by colonial-era agreements. Even traditionally, pro-Western African states found their populations expressing support for Burkina Faso's bold stance. The Organization of African Unity's founding principles of sovereignty and non-interference resonated with new power across the continent. Continental support grew stronger each day, creating a united front that Western diplomats had not anticipated. As African leaders prepared for an extraordinary summit to address the crisis, The continent stood more united than it had been in decades, rallied around the simple but powerful principle that Africans should determine their own destiny. 3 weeks after the declaration, the presidential palace in Ouagadougou hosted an unprecedented gathering as international mediators arrived seeking a face-saving solution for all parties. African Union Chairman Moussa Faki led the mediation team, flanked by respected elders, including former South African President Thabo Mbeki and Ghana's Jerry Rawlings. The negotiation room buzzed with translators working in French, English and local languages as representatives from NATO countries sat across from Burkina Faso officials. President Traoré entered wearing his military uniform, his bearing confident but respectful, understanding that diplomacy required different skills than military command. The morning light filtering through the palace windows seemed to bless these crucial talks that would determine whether the standoff ended peacefully or escalated into something more dangerous. Each participant carried the weight of their nation's expectations and the awareness that African eyes across the continent were watching. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful, like the moment before seasonal rains break a long drought. We propose a phased withdrawal over 6 months, with joint training programs transitioning to African Union peacekeeping forces, suggested the AU mediator, his proposal designed to give all parties a dignified exit strategy. NATO representatives, led by a seasoned French diplomat, countered with offers of reduced presence and shared command structures that would maintain some Western influence. President Traoré listened carefully, his military training evident in his attention to tactical details, while his political instincts evaluated the broader implications. Any agreement must respect our fundamental principle. Burkina Faso soil must be defended by Burkina Faso forces, he stated firmly, his words carrying the weight of popular mandate. The room fell silent as participants absorbed the non-negotiable nature of his position. Foreign Minister Sankara provided legal analysis of each proposal, her expertise crucial in avoiding future loopholes or misunderstandings. Hours passed as negotiators refined language that would satisfy sovereignty demands while acknowledging legitimate security concerns. The breakthrough came when President Traoré proposed a continental security framework that would replace bilateral military agreements with multilateral African-led initiatives. Instead of foreign bases, we offer partnership, training exchanges, intelligence sharing, and joint operations under African command, he explained, his vision transforming confrontation into cooperation. The proposal resonated with AU representatives who had long advocated for African solutions to African problems. NATO officials requested time to consult their capitals, understanding that this represented a fundamental shift from military presence to genuine partnership. The Burkina Faso position gained strength from demonstrations of continental support, arriving hourly through diplomatic channels. Media coverage showed massive rallies across Africa supporting the sovereignty principle, making Western capitulation to African demands politically palatable. The negotiation room buzzed with excitement as participants realized they were crafting not just a withdrawal agreement, but a new model for international relations. As sunset painted the Ouagadougou sky in brilliant oranges and purples, the historic agreement was signed in a ceremony broadcast live across Africa and the world. President Traoré's signature was firm and decisive, followed by AU officials and reluctant but resigned Western representatives. The 30-day deadline would be met with a negotiated withdrawal that preserved dignity for all parties while establishing African sovereignty as non-negotiable. Celebrations erupted in the streets outside the palace as news spread, with citizens dancing to traditional drums that seemed to echo across the continent. The agreement included provisions for economic cooperation, technology transfer, and security partnerships based on equality rather than dependence. As night fell, President Traoré addressed the nation from the same studio where he had made his historic declaration, his words now carrying the authority of victory achieved through principle rather than force. The young captain had not only challenged the world's most powerful military alliance, but had negotiated a new framework for African independence that would inspire generations to come. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's bold stand against foreign military presence proved that true sovereignty requires courage, unity, and unwavering principle. His victory opened a new chapter for African independence, inspiring a generation to reclaim their continent's destiny. What do you think about this historic moment? Subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below.